The marble statues stand silent in museums across the world, their perfect forms frozen in timeless beauty. We gaze upon these remnants of ancient Greece and see civilization's golden age, democracy, philosophy, art that still moves us millennia later. But beneath that polished marble surface lay practices so disturbing, so fundamentally alien to our modern sensibilities, that they challenge everything we think we know about this celebrated culture. What I'm about to reveal isn't found in your high school history textbooks or glossy museum exhibitions. These are the sexual customs that historians whisper about in academic circles, the rituals that were considered not just normal, but sacred in a society we've placed on a pedestal. Today, we're stripping away the romantic veneer to examine the brutal reality of intimate life in ancient Greece, a reality that would horrify even the most liberal modern observer. The year was 450 BCE, and Athens was experiencing its golden age under Pericles. The Parthenon gleamed white against the Mediterranean sky, philosophers debated in the Agora, and playwrights crafted tragedies that still echo through Western literature. But walk through the narrow streets of this celebrated city-state, and you'd encounter scenes that would make your stomach turn. Sexual practices weren't just personal choices. They were woven into the very fabric of religious ceremony, political power, and social hierarchy. We think we understand the Greeks because we've inherited their architecture and their ideas about democracy, but their sexual world operated by rules so foreign, so deeply disturbing, that they reveal a civilization as alien as any we might find on a distant planet. The Greeks themselves left detailed records of these practices, painted on pottery, carved in stone, described in literature. Yet modern scholarship has sanitized these accounts, focusing on the philosophical achievements while burying the horrific realities of daily life. What makes these practices particularly unsettling isn't just their content, but how systematically they were integrated into Greek society. These weren't aberrations or crimes. They were cultural institutions backed by religious authority and social tradition. The same society that gave us Socrates and Plato normalized sexual behaviors that would be considered among the most serious crimes in any modern legal system. The evidence comes from multiple sources that paint a consistent and disturbing picture. Archaeological excavations have uncovered explicit artwork that leaves no doubt about Greek sexual customs. Literary sources from authors like Aristophanes and Plato provide detailed descriptions of practices they considered routine. Legal documents reveal how these behaviors were regulated rather than prohibited. Even religious texts describe sexual rituals as forms of divine worship. But here's what makes this investigation particularly chilling. The Greeks weren't primitive barbarians operating without moral frameworks. They had sophisticated ethical systems, complex laws, and detailed social hierarchies. They debated justice, virtue, and the good life with a precision that still influences modern philosophy. Yet within this same intellectual framework, they normalized sexual practices that defy human dignity in ways that are difficult to comprehend. The first and perhaps most widespread of these practices centered on what the Greeks euphemistically called mentorship between older men and adolescent boys. But this wasn't the idealized philosophical relationship that modern romantics imagine. The reality was a systematic institution of sexual exploitation that permeated every level of Greek society, from the highest aristocratic families to the humblest craftsmen. This practice, known as pederasty, wasn't hidden or shameful. It was celebrated as the highest form of education and social bonding. Wealthy adult men, typically in their 30s or 40s, would select boys between the ages of 12 and 18 as their protégés. The relationship was expected to include sexual submission from the younger partner in exchange for social advancement, education, and protection. What we would recognize as child abuse was reframed as a noble tradition of passing wisdom from one generation to the next. The mechanics of these relationships reveal their true nature. The older partner, called the Erastes, would court his chosen boy through gifts, poetry, and public displays of affection. Once the relationship was established, the boy was expected to submit to sexual acts while maintaining an appearance of reluctant compliance. Greek literature describes the ideal youth as someone who yielded to his mentor's advances not out of desire but out of respect and gratitude. These weren't brief encounters or isolated incidents. Pederastic relationships typically lasted several years, during which the boy lived in a state of sexual servitude disguised as educational privilege. The older man gained not just sexual access, but social prestige. Being seen with a beautiful young protégé enhanced his reputation among peers. The boy, meanwhile, had no choice but to accept this arrangement if he hoped to advance in society. The practice was so normalized that parents actively sought out prestigious older men to form these relationships with their sons. Fathers viewed it as an honor when a respected citizen selected their boy for mentorship. The sexual component wasn't ignored or denied, it was understood as part of the educational process. Greek medical texts even provided advice on how young men should prepare themselves for these encounters, treating sexual submission as a skill to be learned alongside rhetoric and athletics. What makes this even more disturbing is how the Greeks justified these relationships through philosophical frameworks that sound almost reasonable until you examine their implications. They argued that physical beauty in young men reflected spiritual perfection, and that sexual contact with this beauty elevated both partners toward divine understanding. The older man claimed to be teaching the boy about love, virtue, and wisdom through physical intimacy. This wasn't just theory, it was practiced by the most celebrated figures in Greek history. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, maintained relationships with multiple young men throughout his life. His dialogues are filled with discussions of beautiful boys and the proper way to court them. Plato wrote extensively about the educational value of these relationships, arguing they were superior to heterosexual marriage for developing virtue and wisdom. The gymnasium, which we imagine as a place of athletic training, was actually the primary hunting ground for these relationships. Adult men would spend hours watching young athletes exercise, selecting potential partners based on physical beauty and family status. The nudity that characterized Greek athletic culture wasn't just about freedom of movement, it was about display and selection in what amounted to a systematic marketplace for sexual access to minors. Even more chilling was how the practice extended beyond individual relationships into institutional settings. Military units were organized around pederastic bonds, with older soldiers paired with younger ones in relationships that combined training, mentorship, and sexual exploitation. The famous Sacred Band of Thebes was an elite fighting unit composed entirely of these paired couples, with the theory being that men would fight more bravely to protect their beloved partners. The religious dimension adds another layer of horror to these practices. Greek mythology was filled with stories of gods pursuing and capturing beautiful young men, providing divine precedent for mortal behavior. Religious festivals included rituals where young men were symbolically offered to the gods through older male intermediaries. Temples employed young male prostitutes as part of their religious services, with sexual contact framed as a form of worship. The transition from boyhood to manhood was marked by ceremonies that celebrated the end of these relationships, but the psychological damage was already complete. Young men who had spent years in sexual servitude were expected to seamlessly transition into adult roles, often becoming mentors to new boys themselves. The cycle perpetuated across generations, with each cohort of victims becoming the next generation of perpetrators. Greek pottery provides some of the most explicit evidence of these practices, with hundreds of surviving vessels decorated with scenes of older men pursuing, courting, and engaging in sexual acts with adolescent boys. These weren't hidden or shameful images, they were displayed prominently in homes and public spaces, celebrating what the culture considered beautiful and noble relationships. The legal framework surrounding these practices reveals how thoroughly institutionalized they had become. Greek law didn't prohibit sexual relationships between men and boys, it regulated them. Specific rules governed how these courtships could be conducted, what gifts were appropriate, and how the relationships should be managed. The concern wasn't protecting children from exploitation, but ensuring that these relationships followed proper social protocols. What's particularly disturbing is how the Greeks distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable forms of these relationships based not on the age or consent of the younger partner, but on social status and public perception. A relationship between a citizen and a freeborn boy was celebrated, while the same acts with a slave were considered degrading to the older partner. The harm to the younger person wasn't part of the moral calculation. The psychological impact on the boys involved in these relationships was documented in Greek medical and philosophical texts, though always through the lens of how to manage rather than prevent the damage. Young men were expected to develop emotional attachments to their mentors while simultaneously maintaining dignity through apparent reluctance. This impossible balance created psychological trauma that Greek physicians recognized but treated as a necessary part of male development. The practice extended beyond Athens to virtually every Greek city-state, though with regional variations in custom and ritual. Sparta institutionalized these relationships within its military training system, while island communities developed their own traditions around seasonal festivals where older men would select young partners. The consistency across different Greek societies suggests this wasn't an aberrant local custom, but a fundamental aspect of Greek masculine culture. The economic dimension reveals another layer of exploitation. Wealthy families used these relationships as forms of social networking, with sons essentially traded to secure political and business advantages. Beautiful boys became commodities in a market where sexual access was exchanged for social mobility, creating a system that combined child abuse with economic exploitation. Greek literature celebrates many of these relationships as grand romantic narratives, but reading between the lines reveals the coercion and manipulation involved. Love poetry addressed to young men typically emphasizes the power dynamic, with the older partner describing his authority over the younger and the boy's duty to submit. What's presented as romance was actually systematic grooming and abuse disguised in flowery language. The religious festivals that punctuated the Greek calendar often included ceremonies where these relationships were publicly celebrated and renewed. Young men would be paraded before crowds, their beauty praised as a gift to the community. Their mentors would receive public recognition for their role in developing these promising youths. The entire society participated in normalizing and celebrating what amounted to organized child abuse. The transition ceremonies that marked the end of these mentorship relationships provide perhaps the most revealing glimpse into their true nature. When a boy reached his late teens, elaborate rituals celebrated his graduation from sexual servitude to adult citizenship. These ceremonies, documented in detail on surviving pottery and described in contemporary accounts, involved the symbolic cutting of the youth's long hair and his presentation with adult clothing and weapons. But the psychological scars ran far deeper than any ritual could heal. Greek medical texts describe a condition they called mentor melancholy, a form of depression that afflicted young men after these relationships ended. The symptoms included loss of appetite, disturbed sleep, and what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Greek physicians prescribed various treatments, from herbal remedies to physical exercise, but never questioned the system that created this suffering in the first place. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the individual relationships themselves, but how the entire educational system was built around them. Greek schools weren't just places of learning, they were markets where older men could observe and select potential partners from among the students. Teachers were expected to facilitate these connections, and parents paid premium fees to schools known for attracting wealthy mentors. Education became inseparable from sexual exploitation. The gymnasium culture reveals the calculated nature of this system. These weren't casual encounters between adults and minors. They were the result of systematic observation and selection. Older men would spend months studying the habits, personalities, and physical development of potential targets. They kept detailed mental notes on which boys came from influential families, which showed promise in athletics or academics, and which seemed most likely to submit to authority. The courting process itself was ritualized to an extreme degree. Potential mentors would commission poets to write verses praising their chosen boy's beauty. They would hire musicians to serenade him during public events. Expensive gifts, jewelry, fine clothing, exotic foods would arrive at the boy's family home with elaborate notes expressing devotion. To modernize, this looks like romantic courtship, but the power dynamics reveal it as sophisticated grooming on a societal scale. Greek pottery workshops mass-produced vessels depicting these courtship scenes, suggesting there was a thriving market for artwork celebrating what we now recognize as predatory behavior. These weren't rare or hidden images. They were common household items displayed proudly in homes across the Greek world. Families would eat and drink from vessels decorated with scenes of older men pursuing adolescent boys, normalizing these relationships even in domestic settings. The religious justification reached its peak in certain mystery cults that promised spiritual enlightenment through these relationships. Initiates were taught that sexual contact with beautiful young men was a form of divine communion, bringing participants closer to the gods. Sacred texts describe the physical beauty of youth as a reflection of celestial perfection, making sexual desire for adolescence not just acceptable but spiritually necessary. The festival of Dionysus provides a particularly disturbing example of how these practices were woven into religious observance. During these celebrations, which could last for weeks, normal social rules were suspended. Older men were encouraged to pursue any young person who caught their interest, with the understanding that resistance would offend the god. The festivals became hunting seasons where predators could operate with divine sanction. Military training camps institutionalized these relationships in ways that combined physical conditioning with systematic abuse. Young recruits were assigned to older soldiers not just for tactical instruction but for complete personal servitude. The training included not only weapons handling and formation fighting, but also instruction on how to please their mentors sexually. Military manuals from the period describe these relationships as essential for unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The Sacred Band of Thebes wasn't unique. Similar military units existed throughout the Greek world, all organized around these sexually exploitative relationships. Military commanders believed that soldiers would fight more fiercely to protect their young partners, but the system also ensured absolute obedience within the ranks. A young soldier who displeased his mentor faced not just military punishment, but social ostracism and potential exile from the only community he knew. The legal codes that govern these relationships reveal their systematic nature. Specific laws outlined the proper procedures for establishing mentorship bonds, the responsibilities of both parties, and the penalties for violations. But the violations weren't about protecting minors from abuse. They were about maintaining social order and preventing conflicts between rival mentors. A boy who accepted attention from multiple older men simultaneously could trigger legal disputes over ownership rights. Court records from ancient Athens show dozens of cases involving disputes over these relationships. Men sued each other for interfering with established mentorship bonds. Parents brought legal action against mentors who failed to provide promised educational benefits. Young men themselves occasionally appeared in court, but always as property in dispute rather than as victims seeking justice. The legal system treated them as commodities whose value could be measured and compensated. The economic marketplace that developed around these relationships was surprisingly sophisticated. Wealthy families would invest in their sons' physical appearance and education specifically to attract prestigious mentors. Professional trainers specialized in preparing young men for these relationships, teaching them not just athletic skills, but also the subtle arts of attraction and submission. Beauty became a form of currency that families used to purchase social advancement. Professional matchmakers operated openly in major Greek cities, maintaining detailed knowledge of which older men were seeking new protégés and which families had sons available for mentorship. These intermediaries charged substantial fees for successful connections, treating the arrangement of child abuse as a legitimate business enterprise. Their services were advertised in public spaces and recommended by satisfied customers. The psychological manipulation involved in maintaining these relationships was documented in Greek philosophical texts, though presented as wisdom rather than abuse. Mentors were advised on techniques for maintaining emotional control over their protégés, how to alternate affection with withdrawal to create dependency, how to use shame and praise to shape behavior, how to isolate boys from other influences that might encourage resistance. The transition from victim to perpetrator was carefully managed through social institutions designed to ensure the cycle continued. Young men who had endured these relationships were gradually introduced to the mentor community, initially as observers and eventually as participants. The trauma they had experienced was reframed as valuable preparation for their future role as educators and guides for the next generation. Greek medical texts describe the physical damage these relationships caused, though always in clinical terms that avoided moral judgment. Physicians documented injuries and conditions that resulted from sexual abuse, prescribing treatments and preventive measures, but they never questioned why such injuries were so common among young men, treating them as inevitable consequences of normal social development. The artwork commissioned by wealthy Greeks reveals the aesthetic dimension of this exploitation. Sculptures and paintings depicted idealized relationships between older men and beautiful youths, but the artistic conventions reveal the power dynamics involved. The older figures are always shown as active and dominant, while the younger ones appear passive and submissive. Even in artistic representation, the reality of coercion and control couldn't be completely hidden. The festival calendars of Greek cities were organized around events that celebrated and renewed these relationships. Seasonal ceremonies marked different stages of mentorship bonds, from initial courtship through consummation to eventual transition. Religious authorities blessed these relationships as forms of divine service, while civic leaders praised them as essential for maintaining social order and cultural continuity. The international dimension reveals how widespread these practices were across the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek colonies carried these customs to distant shores, establishing them in communities from Spain to the Black Sea. Trading networks spread not just goods and ideas, but also social practices, including systematic approaches to what we now recognize as organized child abuse. The educational philosophy that justified these relationships was developed by some of history's most celebrated thinkers, whose ideas continue to influence modern thought. The same intellectual framework that gave us concepts of justice, virtue, and the examined life also provided elaborate justifications for sexual exploitation of minors. This contradiction reveals something deeply troubling about how sophisticated societies can rationalize systematic harm. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond ancient Greece itself, influencing other cultures and civilizations that came into contact with Greek ideas. Roman adoption of Greek educational methods included these relationship models, spreading the system across an even wider geographic area. The intellectual prestige of Greek culture helped normalize practices that might otherwise have been rejected by societies with different values. The documentation becomes even more disturbing when we examine the ritualized aspects of these relationships within Greek religious contexts. Temple records reveal that certain sanctuaries maintained what were essentially breeding programs, where young boys were selected based on physical attributes and trained specifically for religious service that included sexual availability to adult worshippers. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic operations that lasted for centuries. The Temple of Apollo at Delphi, one of the most sacred sites in the Greek world, employed dozens of young male attendants whose duties extended far beyond traditional religious service. Surviving administrative documents detail how these boys were recruited from families across Greece, often through deceptive promises of religious education and spiritual advancement. Once installed at the temple, they found themselves trapped in a system that combined religious authority with sexual exploitation. The selection process for these temple positions reveals the calculated nature of the abuse. Religious officials would travel throughout Greek territories, attending local festivals and athletic competitions to identify potential candidates. They looked for specific physical characteristics, smooth skin, symmetrical features, graceful movement, that aligned with their aesthetic ideals. Families were approached with offers that seemed too generous to refuse. Their sons would receive the finest education, live in luxury, and serve the gods themselves. But the reality behind the temple walls was far different from these promises. The boys lived in dormitories under constant supervision, their movements restricted and their contact with the outside world carefully controlled. Their days were structured around religious ceremonies that served as elaborate performances for adult visitors who paid substantial fees for private audiences with these young attendants. The religious justification for these practices reached levels of sophistication that reveal how thoroughly Greek society had rationalized systematic abuse. Theological texts described the physical beauty of youth as a direct manifestation of divine perfection, making sexual contact with beautiful boys not just permissible but spiritually necessary. Priests taught that these encounters allowed mortals to experience a taste of divine love, bringing them closer to the gods through physical intimacy with their earthly representatives. The economic dimension of temple prostitution was carefully organized and extensively documented. Price lists survived detailing the costs for different types of encounters, with rates varying based on the age, appearance, and training of the young attendants. Wealthy pilgrims could purchase exclusive access for extended periods, while more modest visitors could afford brief encounters during festival seasons. The training these boys received was designed to maximize their appeal to adult visitors while minimizing their ability to resist or complain. They learned to perform elaborate dances that emphasized their physical attributes, to recite poetry that celebrated their own beauty, and to conduct themselves with a combination of innocence and availability that their customers found irresistible. This wasn't education, it was systematic grooming disguised as religious instruction. The psychological damage inflicted by these temple systems was documented in medical texts that describe a condition physicians called sacred melancholy. a form of severe depression that afflicted many of these young attendants. Symptoms included loss of appetite, disrupted sleep patterns, episodes of uncontrollable weeping, and what we would now recognize as dissociative episodes where victims seem to mentally disconnect from their physical surroundings. Greek physicians developed treatments for this condition, but they focused on managing symptoms rather than addressing causes. Herbal remedies were prescribed to improve appetite and sleep, while physical exercises were recommended to restore emotional balance. Some medical texts even suggest that sexual activity with temple visitors could be therapeutic, demonstrating how completely the medical establishment had internalized the normalization of abuse. The transition rituals that mark the end of temple service provide perhaps the most chilling evidence of how systematically these institutions destroyed young lives. When boys reached their late teens and were considered too old for their religious duties, elaborate ceremonies celebrated their graduation to adult status. But many of these young men struggled to adapt to life outside the temples, having spent their formative years in environments that bore no resemblance to normal society. Temple records describe the fate of former attendants with clinical detachment. Some became priests themselves, perpetuating the system that had victimized them. Others descended into poverty and social isolation, unable to form healthy relationships or maintain stable employment. A disturbing number died young from what medical texts describe as wasting diseases, though the symptoms suggest conditions we would now recognize as related to severe psychological trauma. The artistic production surrounding these temple practices reveals how completely Greek society had aestheticized abuse. Sculptors and painters created works celebrating the beauty of these young attendants, depicting them in poses that emphasized their vulnerability, their availability while suggesting. These weren't hidden or shameful images, they were displayed prominently in public spaces and private homes throughout the Greek world. The religious festivals that brought thousands of pilgrims to these temples created seasonal spikes in demand that required careful management. Temple administrators developed sophisticated scheduling systems to maximize revenue while maintaining the appearance of religious propriety. Special ceremonies were created specifically to showcase the young attendants, with elaborate processions and performances that served as advertisements for private services. The international reputation of Greek temples for these services drew visitors from across the known world, creating a form of religious tourism that was actually systematic child trafficking. Wealthy Romans, Phoenicians, and Egyptians traveled to Greece specifically to access these young attendants, bringing foreign currency and exotic gifts that enriched the temple treasuries while funding continued abuse. The legal protections that surrounded temple operations reveal how thoroughly Greek society had institutionalized these practices. Religious law granted temples immunity from most civil regulations, allowing them to operate with minimal oversight. When complaints were occasionally filed by families seeking to reclaim their sons, religious authorities could invoke divine mandate to justify their refusal to cooperate with secular authorities. The educational component of temple service was used to justify practices that were transparently abusive. Young attendants were taught to read and write, skills that were relatively rare in the ancient world, but this literacy was primarily used to compose letters to potential clients or to maintain detailed records of their sexual encounters. The education served the institution rather than the individual, creating literate slaves rather than empowered citizens. The medical examinations that young temple attendants underwent reveal the systematic nature of their exploitation. Surviving records describe regular physical inspections designed to verify that boys remained suitable for their duties, with detailed documentation of their development and physical condition. These weren't health checks, they were quality control measures designed to maintain product standards in what amounted to a sophisticated commercial enterprise. The networking that developed around temple prostitution created connections between religious institutions across the Greek world. Temples would trade attendants with each other, sharing particularly desirable boys or exchanging older youths for younger replacements. This trafficking network operated openly, with formal agreements and financial arrangements that treated human beings as valuable commodities. The seasonal cycles that governed temple operations were carefully calibrated to maximize both religious significance and commercial profit. Major festivals drew the largest crowds and commanded premium prices, while quieter periods were used for training new attendants and maintaining facilities. The religious calendar became a business plan that scheduled systematic abuse around divine observances. The retirement provisions for aging temple attendants reveal the callous calculation behind these institutions. Boys who had served faithfully for years were typically dismissed with minimal compensation, expected to make their own way in a world for which their temple experience had left them completely unprepared. Some received small pensions or minor positions within the religious hierarchy, but most faced lives of poverty and social marginalization. The documentation of resistance attempts provides heartbreaking evidence of how completely these systems crushed individual agency. Records describe boys who tried to escape, only to be returned by local authorities who viewed them as temple property. Others attempted to refuse participation in certain activities, only to face severe punishments that included physical abuse, food deprivation, and complete social isolation. The family dynamics surrounding temple service reveal another layer of systematic exploitation. Parents who had surrendered their sons to religious institutions often maintained contact through letters and visits, but these interactions were carefully monitored and controlled by temple authorities. Families were encouraged to view their sons' service as a source of pride and divine favor, making it difficult for boys to communicate their suffering or seek help. The architectural design of temples accommodated these practices with spaces specifically created for private encounters between adult visitors and young attendants. Surviving building plans show networks of small chambers connected to main worship areas, with discrete entrances and soundproofing that allowed activities to continue without disturbing regular religious services. The physical spaces were designed to facilitate abuse while maintaining religious appearances. The supply chains that supported temple operations reveal the commercial infrastructure built around systematic child exploitation. Merchants specialized in providing luxury goods that enhanced the appeal of young attendants: fine clothing, cosmetics, jewelry, and exotic perfumes. Food suppliers delivered special diets designed to maintain the physical condition that customers demanded. Even mundane services like laundry and cleaning were organized around the specific needs of these institutions. The cultural impact of temple prostitution extended far beyond the immediate victims, shaping Greek attitudes towards sexuality, childhood, and religious authority in ways that influenced the broader society. The normalization of these practices in religious contexts provided justification for similar behaviors in secular settings, creating a culture where sexual access to minors was viewed as a privilege of adult status rather than a violation of human dignity. The intellectual frameworks developed to justify temple prostitution demonstrate how sophisticated philosophical systems can be twisted to rationalize. Greek allies systematic harm, theologians and philosophers created elaborate theories about the spiritual significance of physical beauty and the educational value of sexual submission, producing scholarly works that provided intellectual cover for practices that were transparently exploitative. The international influence of these Greek religious practices spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, with temples in Greek colonies adopting similar systems and local religious institutions, adapting these methods to their own cultural contexts. The intellectual prestige of Greek civilization helped normalize practices that might otherwise have been rejected by societies with different values, creating a network of systematic abuse that extended across multiple cultures and civilizations. The legacy of these temple systems continued long after the classical period ended, with later religious institutions adapting similar methods and justifications. The intellectual frameworks developed to rationalize these practices influenced religious and philosophical thought for centuries, demonstrating how ideas created to justify systematic harm can persist and spread even when the original context disappears. As we close this disturbing chapter of human history, we're forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about civilization itself. The same culture that gave us democracy, philosophy, and artistic achievements that still inspire us today also systematized the sexual exploitation of children on a scale that defies comprehension. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural aberrations. They were foundational institutions that shaped every aspect of Greek society for centuries. The marble statues that grace our museums today were carved by artists who lived in a world where child abuse was not just tolerated, but celebrated as the highest form of education and spiritual enlightenment. The philosophical texts we study in universities were written by men who participated in systems of exploitation that would horrify any modern observer. The democratic ideals we've inherited came from a society that treated children as commodities in markets of sexual commerce. This isn't ancient history, it's a warning. When we examine how thoroughly Greek society rationalized systematic harm through religious authority, philosophical justification, and cultural tradition, we see the dangerous capacity of any civilization to normalize the unthinkable. The Greeks weren't monsters. They were humans who created institutions that transformed ordinary people into participants in systematic abuse. The next time you see those pristine marble statues or read about the Golden Age of Athens, remember the voices that history tried to silence, the countless young victims whose suffering was reframed as education, whose trauma was celebrated as spiritual growth, whose humanity was sacrificed to maintain systems of power that we're still taught to admire. Human dignity isn't automatic, it's fragile, and it requires constant vigilance to protect.